Okay, shalom to everybody. I actually brought in a treat today in honor of Yom Yerushalayim. My parents saved the Time magazine from the week before the Six-Day War and the week after the Six-Day War. And this is exactly the day before the Six-Day War broke out, where the heading is Israel, the Struggle to Survive. You see a very grim-looking Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister at the time. It tells about the famous stuttered speech where he gets on national radio to help calm everybody down. And instead of calming them down, he started stuttering and dropped his pages. And what I found is that especially young people today they think about the liberation of Yerushalayim, but don't realize that the reason why we say Hallel is that we were saved from a very dangerous situation. Israel was talking about being annihilated, and today it is difficult to imagine that exactly 1 week later, Time magazine writes about how Israel won the war and changed not just the Middle East, but changed the entire world regarding the balance between America and Russia. And I just mentioned that because some of the people here may remember the Six-Day War and others not. And if you really want to celebrate Yom Yerushalayim, it's really important to learn as much as possible about the Tkufat Hamtana, the waiting period, where Israel was under siege and blockaded, and there was a massive call-up. And they were even talking about making a kinder transport to bring children out of Israel to America or to Europe. And it's a good opportunity to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for saving us. What I want to do in honor of Yom Yerushalayim is to look at Yerushalayim as a way of helping us understand mankind in general. Rav Kook has a fantastic take on philosophy where he basically says that you can summarize all of the philosophies of the world under 3 categories. And we'll start with Yerushalayim. Let's put the share screen on. Yerushalayim, we always begin, at least many of the ceremonies begin with Tehillim Kuf Chav Bet, chapter 122, where we know that David HaMelech, King David, he bought the Temple Mount. He did not build the Beit HaMikdash. On the other hand, it tells us that he's dreaming about, in his mind's eye, what Yerushalayim HaBnuya, when Yerushalayim is built, what it's going to be like. Shir HaMalot LeDavid, Samachti Ba'omrim Li Beit Adonai Nelech. Again, David is imagining, I was happy when people said to me, let's go up to the house of God. Omdot hayu ragleinu b'sh'arayich Yerushalayim. Our feet were standing outside the gates of Yerushalayim. We know that any large city has a lot of gates today. People know Shar Yafo, Shar Shechem, Shar Ashpot. And David is imagining himself by the gates of Yerushalayim, a metropolis. Yerushalayim HaBenuya. Yerushalayim, when she is built, Ki'ir Shechubra La Yachdav. It is like a city which combines it together. Now, I remember our teacher in literature, Lahavdil, always used to suggest, first thing, to give a koteret, to give a heading to the poem. And we can use this also regarding the holy writings in the Tehillim. And there are those that say that the heading here is Yerushalayim HaBnuya. Yerushalayim, when she is built, she combines it all together. Now, if I were to ask you, what does Yerushalayim mechaber? What does she unite? Just about anything that you will say is found in the commentaries. We'll open to suggestions. What does Yerushalayim unite?
The tribes?
Okay, the tribes. That's one of the most popular answers, that all the 12 tribes go up to the Beit HaMikdash. And David HaMelech mentions that in the next pasuk. What else?
Religions.
The religions, right? We know that Yerushalayim is not just for the Jewish people, right? V'nikvu elea kol hagoyim, v'na'aru elav kol hagoyim. That we know from Yeshayahu that that's the way it was, and that's the way it's supposed to be in the future, that all of the nations of the world will all gather together in Yerushalayim. We know this from Josephus. He talks about how people from all the religions used to come and bring korbanot, bring sacrifices in Yerushalayim. What else? Any other suggestions? What does Yerushalayim's unite? Yeah, Noah?
Well, I remember in one of my history classes, they showed diagrams from the Middle Ages of Christian Europe and what they drew the map. And it said in Latin text, Jerusalem right in the middle. So from a historical standpoint, it's the physical center of the world.
Fantastic.
Next 3 continents.
Right? What they used to call that the flower map. Before Columbus, they drew the world as a flower, where one petal was Europe, Africa, Asia, and in the middle, Jerusalem. Okay. Any other suggestions? Okay, there are those that say that Yerushalayim combines the heaven and the earth. Yerushalayim shel Mala and Yerushalayim shel Mata. Others say that Yerushalayim combines the physical and the spiritual, where it's a physical city, but it's holy. Others say that Yerushalayim combines the sons of Rachel with the sons of Leah, because it's right on the border between Yehuda and Binyamin. Yehuda was the son of Leah, and Binyamin was the son of Rachel. B'kitzur. Excuse me. There are a lot of different suggestions what Yerushalayim unites. But what I want to suggest is that David HaMelech here tells us exactly what he means. Because in the next pasuk, pasuk Dalid, Shesham, She means because. She is, just like in any spoken language, one of the ways that you could tell in Anglo is if he says don't instead of do not. Right? Only a foreigner will say cannot. English speakers say can't, don't. Same thing in Hebrew. In Hebrew, there are a lot of words that got shortened over time. One of them is ka'asher, where that is, which little by little became shortened to she, that. By the way, the Talmud Yerushalmi calls Beit Sha'an, Beishan, one word, Bet Yud Shin Nun. Instead of 2 words, Bet Yud Tav, Beit She'an. Just like Israeli kids today, where they write Yom Uledet, a birthday is 1 word. It's slang, and I don't know if Ben Yehuda likes such a type of slangs, but as we spoke about last time, when we spoke about the holiness of Hebrew language, part of the Hebrew language is that it evolves. And the Hebrew of Yeshayahu is a little different than that of Moshe. And the Hebrew of the Mishnah is a little different from that of Yeshayahu. And that's the nature. Anyway, inside the Tanakh, She, what does because do at the beginning of a pasuk? It connects it with the previous pasuk. We just said that Yerushalayim unites together because Shesham alu shvatim shiteri ha'idut liYisrael lodot l'shem Hashem, because that is where the tribes used to come up to the Beit HaMikdash. Pasuk Hey, ki. What is ki? Also because at the beginning of the pasuk, it also connects what we said before. In other words, the topic is, what does Yerushalayim unite? First thing that it unites is all the tribes unite in the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. But here in Pasuk Hey, it adds another aspect. Kishama yashvu kisot lemishpat. Because there in Yerushalayim are the thrones of justice. By the way, the word kisei appears 128 times in Tanakh. 122 of the 128 are not referring to a chair, but to a throne. A throne which is a job, a tafkid, right? A misra, an office. So where is the kisot lemishpat, the throne of justice in Yerushalayim? That is the Sanhedrin. We all know the Sanhedrin is on Har Habayit, on the same Temple Mount. Kisot lebeit David, the throne for the kings of David, that is also on Har Habayit. In other words, Yerushalayim unites three aspects of the Jewish people. It is the capital of the king, or our national leader. It is the capital of the Sanhedrin, our religious leadership. And it is the capital of the Beit HaMikdash as well. Now, what is this threesome? These three thrones, for every throne, you need somebody to sit on the throne. And in fact, this is the triumvirate of Jewish leadership. If you think about it, we all know that in ancient Greece, there was a triumvirate, a leadership of three. We see in checks and balances, at least in the United States, probably in most democracies today, they taught us in world history that it is the judicial, executive, and legislative, right? But going back to Am Yisrael, there also were three leaderships. And if you think about it, it has to be three. If there's one leader, he's a dictator. Only God knows it all. If there are two leaders, you have a standoff. It's going to be a power struggle. Inevitably, you need at least three leaders and an odd number in order to solve any kind of debate, so that you go after the majority. Now, this is what it's usually taught. As we're going to see, the Maharal and Rav Kook write that the idea of the trio, the triangle, the triple leadership is a matter of principle. It's a beautiful, deep ideal and ideology. But let's continue. Continues David HaMelech. Again, we've seen that Yerushalayim combines all three. You know what? Let's go back to the sheet. We'll do the share screen. And we'll see that Yerushalayim also, this trio, is found among the Kisot as well. We saw that there is the throne of David, that's the king, the throne of the Sanhedrin. Also Yirmiyahu, source number 2, Paragimel Pasuk Yud Zayin, Ba'etahi, it's talking about in the end of days. Yikru'u Yerushalayim Kisei Hashem. Yerushalayim will be called a third throne, the throne of God. V'nikvu elaha kol hagoyim. All of the goyim will come running to Yerushalayim. All of the nations, l'shem Hashem Yerushalayim, to come and serve God in Yerushalayim. V'lo yelchu od acharei shchirut libam hara. And mankind, even the paganists, will not go after paganism and idolatry anymore. In other words, the Beit HaMikdash, as we said before, is a universal aspect of Yerushalayim. Also, we talk about Ki Beiti Beit Tfilah Yikareh L'chol Ha'amim. That is the way it was, as we saw in Josephus. We see that is the way that it was in Yeshayahu, and that's the way it's supposed to be also in the future. So this is, the universal aspect of Yerushalayim. If we're talking about Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim supposedly has 70 nicknames. And all of the nicknames fit very neatly into one of these three categories. For example, source number 3, Va'ashiva shoftayich kevarishona. Hashem says, I will renew the Sanhedrin, your judges, like in the days of old, v'yoatzeach kevat tfilah, and your advisors, like in the olden days. Acharei ken yikarei lach ir hatzedek kirya ne'emana. The city of justice, the city of emunah, of loyalty, that is another part of Yerushalayim. In Sefer Shmuel, source number 4, Shmuel Bet, Pei Zayin, Vayelkot David et Mitzudat Zion, Hi Ir David. Yerushalayim is also called the city of David, which is the national aspect. There are also a lot of other nicknames of Yerushalayim. We saw Hatzrot Beit Hashem, Moriah, Har Beit Hashem. And if we look down, I made a little chart which will help us understand this triple aspect of Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim has the king's palace, but it also has the Sanhedrin, and also houses the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. Each one of these three is a throne. The Beit HaMikdash is called the throne of God, Kisei Hashem. The Sanhedrin is called Kisot LeMishpat, and Malchut Beit David is called Kisot LeBeit David. On each throne, there is a head. The king sits on the throne of Beit David, of the kingdom, the national leader. The Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, is the official religious leader, the chief rabbi. And the one who's in charge of the Beit HaMikdash is the Kohen Gadol. Now here, it's interesting. A lot of people, they ask, so what's the difference between the religious aspect and the universal aspect? Well, Aaron HaKohen helps us understand, because Aaron HaKohen is the ultimate of the high priest, and Chazal teach us to be the students of Aaron, liot ohev shalom, rodef shalom, to run after peace, and to search peace, ohev et habriot. This is the humanist and the universal aspect of Yerushalayim. And by the way, just an update, thank God, Baruch Hashem, Yerushalayim is rebuilt. And already today, it is the national capital of Israel. It is the religious capital of Israel. And it is also the universal humanist capital. If you're to, for example, to ride on a bus from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim, and anybody who's been in Israel knows that Israelis are very sociable, make conversation, total strangers. And you ask them, why are you going to Yerushalayim? So one person will say, well, I am going to protest by the prime minister. Everybody knows the state of Israel is divided between just Bibi and just not Bibi. So either way, you want to go to Yerushalayim. If you have a problem with your taxes, if you have a problem with your water bill, if you have a problem with really anything official, Yerushalayim is already today the national capital of the Knesset, of the ministries, etc. Another person on the bus will say, I'm going to Yerushalayim to learn Torah. And that is the religious capital. Yerushalayim probably has more yeshivot than any other city in the world, more poskim for sure than any other city in the world, more batei din, more gedolei Torah, and the highest level yeshivas of anywhere in the world. And it already is, not to mention midrashot for women, it is already, undoubtedly, just like it's the national capital, it's also the religious capital. On that same bus, you will see a lot of tourists. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you people realize, most tourists to Israel are not Jewish. They're from China, Germany, America, Muslims, Christians. Now, if you ask them, why are you going to Jerusalem? They don't care that it's the capital of Israel, right? They have their own flag, their own government, their own taxes, their own prime minister. The Gentiles also are not really interested in Shabbat or Kashrut. They're not obligated to follow the Jewish religion. But nevertheless, people come from all over the world because they see Israel as the universal humanist capital of Israel. Anybody who follows the intellectual world knows that whenever the issue of ethics or medical ethics comes up, Jerusalem is consulted. People want to know what the Jewish people have to say. By the way, this is something very interesting. My friend Ravuri Sharkey pointed out, and it just hit me, that for hundreds of years, people spoke about the Judeo-Christo ethic or morality. where they really meant the Christian ethics. But they know that it started with the Jews, and they saw the Christians as the continuation of the Jews. It's not that way anymore. For sure, since 1967, Israel, the Jewish people, are once again on the map. And thank God, not just in terms of high tech, in terms of being the first country to come out of Corona. It's not our topic today, but we Jews have a lot to be proud of, whether you live in Israel or not. I imagine all of you are proud of associating with the Jewish state of Israel. And these are the three aspects of Yerushalayim. By the way, this trio should also sound familiar in source number 5.5. I forgot to put a number here. The Mishnah Pirkei Avot tells us from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Shlosha Ktarim, Keter Torah, Keter Keuna, the Keter Malchut. Sounds familiar, that the three thrones have three heads, and on each head you have a crown. What is the crown? The Kohen Gadol wears the crown of Kehuna. The head of the Sanhedrin wears the crown of Torah. By the way, you have to understand what that means. It's not like today where every Hasidic Rebbe, his Hasidim think that he is the greatest, or that every posek, his followers think that or every Rosh Yeshiva. In the old days, and that's the way it's supposed to be, there is one official head of the Torah world, and that is the Nasi. And then there is the king, who is the national leader, who wears the Keter Malchut. Now, David HaMelech goes back. Let's return to our parak. And again, what have we been talking about? Yerushalayim, when she is built, she unites it all together. It's the national capital, the religious capital, and the universal capital. But then David HaMelech throws us a curveball. Pasuk Vav, Sha'alu Shlom Yerushalayim. Halavai, there should be shalom in Yerushalayim. Yishlayu ohavai. Halavai, there should be peace among those who love Yerushalayim. Yehi shalom bechelech. Halavai, there should be peace between your divisions, between your battalions. Shalva ba'armenotayich. Halavai, there should be peace among your castles. Now, the traditional approach sees the castle of Yerushalayim as the castle of the king. So why is Armonotayich written in the plural? Well, now we understand. Because there were really three castles in Yerushalayim. There is the Beit HaMikdash, there is the Sanhedrin, and there is the palace of the king. But here it's really interesting. Why do we need a special tefillah, a special prayer for peace in Yerushalayim? We know this for every Friday night, every Yom Tov night. We say the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem, Aporei Sukat Shalom Aleinu. God, give us peace. Val Kol Yisrael. Okay, sounds a little broader. The Al Yerushalayim. But then, that minimalizes it again. Why do we need a special prayer for peace in Yerushalayim? The answer is from Tehillim, from our source. This is where it comes from. But we all know that when do you need to pray for peace? When there is no peace. Because there never was peace in Yerushalayim. By the way, my father was a principal of a Jewish day school. And anybody who knows shul politics, school politics, even if you're not in the Knesset, you know that if you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And if you ask the children in the school, who runs the school, they would always say the principal. Right, Debbie? On the other hand, you ask the board, and the board thinks that they run the school. And then, usually in most day schools outside of Israel, there is a local millionaire or two who, they built a building, they bought the land, they pay the salaries, they really hire and fire, and they think that they run the school. So the question is, who really runs the school? And the same thing in every shul. The
The
rabbi thinks that he
secretary.
runs the shul. Sorry?
The
rabbi
secretary.
The rabbi thinks that he runs the shul, and the chazan, he thinks that he runs the services. Then on the third hand, there's a gabbai, the guy with all the keys who opens up everything, and he really runs the day-to-day things. And then on the fourth hand, there's still the millionaire who he bought the building and he pays the salaries. And this is the power struggle that is part of any triumvirate. As soon as there is a checks and balance system, and in Israel, we know this very, very well, that there is a constant struggle between the government and the prime minister and the Supreme Court. And if you look back in Jewish history, it was always this way. Many of you probably remember the story of Bat Yiftach, the daughter of Yiftach, in Sefer Shoftim. The book of Judges, Yiftach is the leader of the Jewish people. Before there was a king, the national leader was called a Shofet. And Yiftach went out to war, and he made a neder. He took an oath, and he said, God, if you help me be victorious at war, the first thing that comes to greet me, I will give as a sacrifice. He thought it would be a goat, a cow. Apparently, it was his daughter. Now, all of you are knowledgeable enough to know that if a person words a vow in a problematic way, what do? Atarat Nedarim. Before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, there is a way to void a vow. According to the Midrash, Yiftach turned to Pinchas. Pinchas lived a long life, and he was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time. And Yiftach said to him, can you please come? I made this terribly worded vow, and I need to do Hatarat Nedarim to annul the vow. Pinchas answered, fine, come to me first thing in the morning. Yiftach answered, well, thank you very much, but I think it's more appropriate for you to come to me because I am the national leader. To which Pinchas answered, well, I disagree. I think that it's more appropriate for you, Yiftach, to come to me because you have the national crown. While Pinchas says, I have also Keter Kahuna and also Keter Torah. He's also the head of the Sanhedrin and also the Kohen Gadol. That's 2 against 1. To which Yiftach answered, but my crown, the national crown, is even greater. Because some of you may know the halacha, everybody can forego their honor. Yeah, it's brought down in Masechet Kiddushin that when your parents come in the room, you should stand up. Most people don't stand up today. For parents can mochel, they can forego their honor. Teachers, rabbis can forego their honor. A Kohen can forego his honor. The only one who can't forego his honor is the king of Israel. Because when Benjamin Netanyahu travels to the United Nations or to America or anywhere, he is not going as a private person. He is representing the nation of Israel. He is representing the Jewish people. So he is not allowed to forego his kavod. Now, we all know that Midrashim, I wrote a lot of articles on Midrashim trying to identify which Midrashim are meant to be taken half literally, mostly literally, totally literally, but most Midrashim are not meant to be taken literally. We don't know what exactly was, but one thing we know for sure, Chazal are telling us about a problem here of the power struggle between the Keter, the different crowns of the leadership of the Jewish people. Let's move on. Yeravam ben Nevat. Most of you remember that as a punishment to Shlomo, the Navi, the prophet Achia Shiloni, took 10 tribes and told Yeravam, you take these 10 tribes and you are the king of Israel. There's the king of Judea, king of Israel, no problem. What was the problem? When Yeravam ben Nevat built a mizbeach, built an altar in Beitel, and appointed me, myself, and I as the Kohen Gadol. And the rabbis came to him, according to Chazal, and said, Lo dai lachem, it's not enough that you have the Keter Malchut, that you are the king. Leave the Keter Kahuna for the Kohanim. They're two different tribes. There's a tribe of Judah and there's the tribe of Levi. You can't wear both crowns. Anybody remember in history where we had the opposite problem? We actually spoke about this in the first year of the series, in the Maccabean dynasty, where the Maccabeans were Kohanim and they took the kingdom for themselves, and Chazal used on them the exact opposite sentence. It's not enough for you that God gave you the priesthood, that you also have to take the kingdom, the national leadership for yourself. Again, this was always a problem. Maybe the biggest tragedy, Mamasha's civil war, was Shimon ben Shetach, and that according to the Ramban, that was the downfall of the Maccabees, according to the Ramban. The Alexander Yanai, one of the later Maccabean kings, was accused of being a Sadducee, that he wasn't so accepting of the oral law. So the Sanhedrin called him in to ask him a couple of questions. Alexander Yanai comes in, say you're the Sanhedrin, and he sits down and he says, you wanted to ask me some questions? Shoot. To which the Sanhedrin says to him, Your Highness should stand up in honor of the Torah, in honor of the Sanhedrin. To which Alexander Yanai answered, no, Your Highness should stand up for me. I am the national leader. And the Sanhedrin answered, but you're not allowed to sit down on the Temple Mount. To which Alexander Yanai answered, to paraphrase Joseph Stalin, the Pope didn't dare interfere too much in politics in those days. But there was one time supposedly where he told Stalin maybe to kill less people, to which Stalin supposedly answered him, can you please remind me, how many battalions do you have? How many divisions do you have? How many soldiers do you have? In other words, I'm stronger than you. Shut up. And that's what Alexander Yanai told the Sanhedrin. You don't have an army. You don't have policeman. And he assassinated the entire Sanhedrin except for Shimon ben Shetach. His brother-in-law was the only one who survived. Now you understand why there had to be a special prayer for Shalom in Yerushalayim. Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Halavai, there should be peace among the leadership of the Jewish people in Yerushalayim, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu put all three leaders on the same mountain. And if you think to yourself, wow, that's just asking for problems. You know what? Let's think. In the modern world, Korban Pesach, can you imagine 12 million Jews going up on Aliyah L'Regel to give a Korban Pesach? Everyone's busy, men, women, children, a lot of excitement, a lot of music, a lot of food. And then out comes the king from his palace. Everybody runs to see the king and to take his picture, maybe take a selfie, get his autograph. The king. 2 minutes later, from the other side of Har HaBayit, comes out the Kohen Gadol with all of his majesty. Everybody turns their back on the king, runs to see the Kohen with his tzitz, Kodesh L'Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Urim V'Tumim. And the king says, hey, what about me? And then 2 minutes later, from the third side of Yerushalayim, comes out the Nasi, the Gadol Ador. Anybody who's ever seen a Rosh Yeshiva come to a wedding or the Kotel, really anywhere, right? He's got all of his students singing and dancing, and the Kohen, they leave the Kohen, they leave the king. Now let's give them credit that it's not an issue of ego, that he gets more honor than I do. There's a serious halacha question. Let's take another nafkamina. Again, Baruch Hashem, Am Yisrael is coming back to the land of Israel. That's a fact. And we hope eventually to have a Beit HaMikdash. Can you imagine if all three of these leaders want to leave Jaffa Gate at the same time. Who goes first? Now, the people from England would probably think, after you. No, after you. No, after you. It was not that way. Because, again, the Kohen Gadol walks around with God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, on his forehead, God's 72-letter name in his Urim V'Tumim. He's not allowed to let anybody go before God. And the Pirchei Kuhuna, the younger Kohanim, will move everybody out of the way. On the other hand, again, whenever you see a Torah scholar coming, you see thousands of students moving everybody out of the way before he gets there. On the third hand, the Kohen, the Melech, the king, is not allowed to let anybody go before him. You'll realize what a problem this is. That is why we have to daven for peace in Yerushalayim. I'll give one other point before we get to the punchline, what the solution is. I don't know if you people ever noticed, but let's see if I can put this on the share screen. Yeah, we'll try and do it here. Did you ever notice that Yerushalayim and Yisrael are the same letters except for the Aleph and the Mem? Yisrael, compare that with Yerushalayim, as it's written in the Tanakh. Did you all catch that? The Yud, the Shin, and the Resh and the Lamed are identical. The whole difference is between the Aleph and the Mem. In other words, Yerushalayim and Am Yisrael really have a very similar role, but the whole difference is, what is the difference between an Aleph and a Mem? Let's start with the Mem. The Mem is very easy. When I say, Ani mi kochav hashachar, what does Mem do? That's what's called the Mem hamakor, where I come from, right? Ani mi Yisrael, Ani mi Yerushalayim. Mem is your place. On the other hand, Aleph is the first letter. According to Kabbalistic sources, Aleph symbolizes the one and only Echad Miyodea, God. And Aleph is the least physical of anything physical. That's God's spark in the world. If so, what is the difference between Yerushalayim and Yisrael? It's the difference between Mem and Aleph. Both Am Yisrael and Yerushalayim are both called the throne of God. But Yisrael is also called the Merkava, the chariot of God. What is the difference between a chariot and a throne? A throne is stationary. That's Yerushalayim. That's the Mem. The godliness in the world, which is stationary, that is the place of Yerushalayim. That's why it's a Mem. Mem is where it's from, the place. On the other hand, the role of Am Yisrael is to be a Merkava, to bring a chair, to be a chariot, to bring godliness into all aspects of life. Am Yisrael even was outside of the land of Israel for 2,000 years, and our role was to bring godliness and morality and the godly ideals to every topic, to every country. Today, thank God that we're back in the land of Israel, and Bezrat Hashem, from now on, once again, just like in the times of the Tanakh and the way it's supposed to be, Yerushalayim is in Yisrael. So how can we influence the world? The answer is through internet, through Zoom. Today, you don't have to be in the same place. Also, before Corona, before COVID, people used to travel. You can come from anywhere in the world to Yerushalayim. And we are supposed to continue influencing the world. But the problem is if we're spread out like fireflies, a spark here and a spark there, what happens today in the world, especially in the open world, the democratic world, instead of the Jewish people influencing the Gentiles, what's happening is when we're living among the Gentiles, they influence us more than we influence them. And that is why the Tanakh, Yeshayahu, talks about the framework of being an Or LaGoyim, a light for the nations, living in Yerushalayim, where from here we'll get all the fireflies together and light up the world. B'kitzur, that's the difference between Yerushalayim and Yisrael, the difference between Mem and Aleph, but we really have the same role, the idea of bringing God, revealing God into the world, also on a stationary basis and also as a chariot. But getting back to Yerushalayim, we mentioned the Triumvirate, we mentioned the triple leadership, we mentioned that Yerushalayim is already today the national and religious and the universal capital. But how are the three supposed to work together? Rav Kook has a very, very interesting take on this. The first point is that there's a heading, HaKodesh HaElyon. If everybody remembers that their position, their throne, their jurisdiction comes from God. He was the one who chose the tribe of Judah. God was the one who chose the tribe of Levi, the Kohanim. God is the one, there's a bracha, Asher Bachar, B'chachamim V'Toratam, that God chose the Torah and the rabbis as well. If we remember that everything comes from God, we'll be in a good position. But as we'll see, there's a lot deeper ideology behind. Rav Kook writes in Sefer Orot, page Ayin. He's writing this 110 years ago, but anybody who knows that we may, in Israel, be in for our 5th elections within 2 years, and the reason is exactly because of what Rav Kook is going to talk about. Shlosha kochot mitavkim ka'et b'machanenu. Again, Rav Kook is writing this in his time, but it's just as true today. There are 3 ideological camps which are wrestling in Am Yisrael. Hamilchama b'neihem nikerati biyoter be'eretz Yisrael. This is most apparent in the land of Israel, because here we have political parties. Aval pulatam ki pula nimshechet michayei ha'umah bichlal. But it's not just this generation. As we saw before, you go back in Jewish history, there always was a power struggle between these 3 ideologies. V'shorsheihem kvuim hem betoch hakara choderet v'merchavei ruach ha'adam. Rav Kook says, it's also not a coincidence that it's in the Jewish people and throughout Jewish history, because this is mankind in a nutshell. The Jewish people represent a concentrated version of mankind. That's what the Maharal writes. In mankind, there are 3 camps. And these are the 3 ideologies that we're talking about. In let's go back into the share screen. In many democracies, you have 2 parties. There are 330 million people, citizens in America, and for them, it's enough to have 2 political parties. There is the right-wing party, called the Republicans. Sometimes it's called the Conservative Party. Sometimes they're called the Hawks. On the other hand, there is the more universal or humanist ideology. That in America is the Democrat Party. They're more liberal. They are called the Doves. In Israel, in addition to the right-wing parties and the left-wing parties, there are also, again, it depends on the separation of church and state in each country, there are also religious parties. And what Rav Kook is saying is that, I'll make it modern, If in last elections, I think there were 36 parties in Israel, you can really break down those 36 parties to fit neatly into these three ideologies. The three ideologies, if we get back to the triangle, here I drew it out. I don't draw well on computer. The idea of the triangle, I'll make it a little larger. Oh, no, how do we go back? Sorry about that. There we go. Okay. The ideology of the triangle, as we see, the Maharal writes of the philosophy of the triangle. There need to be three sides to a triangle, where each of the three sides also kisses the other two sides. Here A kisses B and kisses C. Here also, each side kisses the other two, but also limits the other two from becoming extreme. One of the biggest problems that we know in politics and in society bichlal is extremism. And what Rav Kook is suggesting is the reason why God initiated three different ideologies is because they're all necessary to keep each other in check. What does that mean? Rav Kook explains that as long as someone talks a positive ideology, you should listen to him. The problem is when he begins putting down the other ideologies. If a person thinks that the entire truth is in his pocket, then there's going to be fighting. The lack of tolerance is the source of the problem. For example, let's be practical. David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion, we all know that he dedicated his life to nationalism. He was the major founder of the state of Israel, the first prime minister for many years. He believed in the Hebrew language, in the army, in building the land. If you're to ask Ben-Gurion, what is Judaism? He will say, it's the nation of Israel. It's a nationality. But then ask him, what's his opinion on religion? David Ben-Gurion did not like religion. He said religion was good for the exile. But today we want to have a new Jew, not a Jew, but an Israeli. David Ben-Gurion also had a problem with the universalism. All Israelis know Ben-Gurion's favorite statement when asked, what about if the UN steps in? He said, shmum. Who cares about the United Nations? Or his famous quote, ma ichpat li ma yomru hagoyim. Who cares what the goyim are going to say? What's important is what's good for the Jewish people. Now, 3 years after the Holocaust, where the whole world stood by and didn't help the Jewish people, it's hard to blame someone for that approach. On the other hand, that is an extreme approach, where Judaism is just a nation without religion. On the other hand, if you go into Mea She'arim, you go into Lakewood, and you ask them, what is Judaism? They'll say, what do you mean? It's a religion. And you ask them, well, isn't it also a nationality? All right, even if a Jew is not religious, he's still Jewish, right? And we also have a Jewish language, like nations. We also have a Jewish land. We also have a Jewish coin. We also always had a Jewish army till exile. The Jewish nation is a nation. Our leaders are national leaders. David HaMelech, Shaul HaMelech, Yoshua, Yiftach. So the Haredim in Lakewood will say, well, that's for Goyim, or that's for the secular people. That same Haredi, who says Judaism is a religion, he doesn't see Judaism very much as a universal belief either. Because secular studies and contact with the non-Jewish world, that's just going to lead to assimilation and intermarriage. On the third hand, humanism has the same problem. When humanists think that in the name of humanism, they have to be anti-religious and anti-nationalist, we have a problem. There's a famous concert a couple of years ago where Aviv Geffen, famous singer, took an Israeli flag in the middle of the concert, threw it down, and trampled on the Israeli flag in the name of, he has this song, "Don't call me Jew, don't call me Israeli. I am a human being." And what Rav Kook is saying is that if you build your whole ideology on humanism without religion and without having a special place in your heart for your family, for your nation, humanism, just theoretical humanism, to theoretically love somebody on the other side of the world, that's not real humanism. It's like a wheel. If you look at the diagram, a proper wheel which has 3 spokes, that wheel will function. But if one of the spokes is longer than the other, the wheel is not going to function. Rav Kook says we need nationalism, we need the right-wing parties. We need humanism, we need the left-wing parties. We also need religion. And by the way, here in religion, Rav Kook is referring to religion in the exile limited sense of the word. That's Shabbos, that's keeping kosher, because also Ben Adam Lechavero, humanism is also part of the Torah. And also Jewish nationalism, as we said, is also part of the Torah. The idea, again, is to speak in favor, not to speak against. Somebody once asked Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, how do you know that religious Zionism is correct? Lubavitch say that they're correct, and Satmar says that they're correct, and the socialists say everybody thinks that they're correct. So why are you any different? Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook answered, because religious Zionism, humanism, believes that everyone is correct. If you take the positive aspect of each ideology, for example, if somebody talks in favor of learning Torah, I listen. But if he talks against serving in the Israeli army, that's already negative. That's not for me. Or vice versa. If somebody says you have to serve in the army and build the land of Israel, that's a positive ideology. I'll listen to him. But if he starts talking against a religion or against learning in yeshiva, so that's when I stop listening. As a matter of fact, Rav Kook goes on to say that inevitably, in a nation of there today about 12 million Jews in the world, inevitably, there are going to be people who are more nationalist-oriented, others who are more religious-oriented, others who are more humanist-oriented. The ideal would be like David HaMelech. David HaMelech was 33, 33, 33. If a person is well-rounded enough, of course, that's the ideal. But usually, especially younger people, and most people, have a certain leaning. I'll look at my children. I have a son who learns in yeshiva. His connection to Judaism is through religion, more than nationalism and more than humanism. But I don't have a problem with that because he's also going to serve in the army. He's not going to do 3 years, but we'll do a half a year. He also learns Musar, and he sees the value of humanism. On the other hand, I have a daughter who is a social worker, and she is a vegetarian, and her Judaism is mainly humanism. But I don't have a problem because she still davens 3 times a day, and she dresses according to halacha, and she's very Zionist. So the fact that it's 25, 25, 50, I don't have a problem with that either. I also have a son who is an officer in the Israeli army, and he eats and drinks and sleeps army, right? Because that's your life. And I don't have a problem with his connecting to the Jewish nation on the national level more than the religious level, because he davens every day. And he also treats his soldiers very humanely. And this is how to make peace between the three. To talk positive ideologies, because the positive ideologies can all harmonize with each other. And again, each one of the ideologies is meant to kiss the other two, and also to bind it that it doesn't get to an extreme. Rav Kook goes on, we don't have time to see it inside. In source number 10, Rav Kook talks about if somebody claims that he loves all of humanity as much as he loves his family. Rav Kook says that person doesn't know what love is about. He's just talking about love. That's not real humanism. If a person, chas v'shalom, say there was a fire, and you would see a mother run into the building, and there are two children yelling for help, what would you say about the woman who lets her own child burn and saves a stranger's child in the name of altruism? She's crazy. She doesn't know what love is about. That's not altruism. That's not humanism. To the same extent, if you have a Jew, continues Rav Kook, who thinks that in the name of nationalism, he has to hate everything non-Jewish, or he has to hate every Arab in the name of Jewish nationalism or Zionism, Rav Kook says that is not Zionism. Because the beauty of Jewish nationalism is that we are also universal. We want to also bring goodness to the world. And also, if you see a Jew, continues Rav Kook, who thinks that he can feel fulfilled in Judaism just with religion, just with Shabbat and Kashrut, without being part of the nation of Israel, without being part of humanism and morality, he also is missing the boat, because Judaism is all three. Now, the final point is, where are we at today in Jewish history? Something very, very interesting. Because if we look at the chart, I remember when I made Aliyah 40 years ago almost, the challenge was to break down this mechitza between national and religious. When I came to Israel, all the big rabbis were Haredim, who were religious, but not Zionist. On the other hand, all the officers in the army, all the real chalutzim, pioneers, they were the opposite. They were nationalists, Zionists, but very often anti-religious. Over the last 50 years, religious Zionism has very clearly broken down this mechitza. Today, in the Haredi world, it was just on the radio during Corona, they brought, during the bidud period when somebody had to be in quarantine, they had all these yeshiva boys. So the government just said, let's make one hotel just for yeshiva boys. They put the Zionist and the Haredim and the Chaz, they threw them all in the same hotel. And I heard an interview with one of the Haredim on the radio, and he said it was very interesting because they never realized how serious the Torah is in the Hesder yeshivot. And he pointed out that Davka, the Zionists, the religious Zionists, they wake up for davening better than the Haredi boys do. And not only do they know how to learn Gemara, they also know philosophy and Musar and Tanakh. In other words, also in the Chalutzik field today, it's been 20 years since non-religious Zionists have set up a yeshuv. All of the building, the new building in the land of Israel, is done by religious Zionists. The army, the leadership is religious Zionists. National and religious have been combined. Where is the challenge today? I tell my students, the time has come to take down this last mechitza. The mechitza that humanists and universalists, leftists, think that they have a monopoly on humanism. I once was in a debate with a leftist. I was representing national Zionism, religious Zionism, and he claimed that we're not humanist enough. I asked him, how many hours a day do you learn Musar? Do you learn morality? Do you learn humanism? He said, what do you mean? I explained, well, in my midrashah, we learn every day the laws of Shmirat HaLashon, not to talk Lashon Hara. Twice a week, we have Mesilat Yesharim. Once a week, we have Orchot Tzadikim. Once a week, we have Shmona. We have 2 hours a day, every day, on what is the definition of being moral, of what humanity is, of what humanism is, of what universalism is about, and how to make sure that one doesn't get out of kilt, and that you have religion and the Shulchan Aruch and nationalism to keep everything down. And he was floored because, again, the leftists today think that by being a religious Zionist, you are less humanist. And it's up to us to show that that's not at all the case. And that way we can get to the Torah Hashem Tmima and Yerushalayim HaBnuya of showing the world that, yes, inevitably most people will have a stronger leaning either to nationalism or religion or to humanism. But the God of Yerushalayim really unites all three. And that's what the world and world peace and peace in Yerushalayim is about. And hopefully, maybe I'll just finish off with an interesting statistic. Most of you probably are familiar that Israel has by far the highest rate of altruistic kidney donors in the world, by far. United States is ahead of Europe, and Israel is light years ahead of the United States. Within Israel, more than 90% of the kidney donors are religious Zionists. In other words, not the humanists. Humanists usually don't give kidneys. The Haredim aren't the ones who are giving kidneys, but there is something within the Trinity, the threesome, the trio, which brings out the best of all of the ideologies. If anybody has any questions or comments, I would be more than happy.
Okay, you want to take a look at the questions? A lot to unpack. Or you want me to?
This is from chat. Okay.
Yeah, the chat group.
I go to the top or the bottom?
The top.
The top. Okay, here we go. A Wichita, Kansas boy is joining the shiur. Huh? I also was born in Wichita, Kansas. Try to get your number. Anybody wants my number can get it from Rabbi Kelman. My relatives remember graves being dug in local parks, right? In Ganstacker. They were preparing 12,000 graves. I remember in Hebrew school, we were all davening for Israel. It was very scary. Yes, do thank God for the save and victory, but God's instrument was the army, not the yeshiva nor the prayer house. Well, that's exactly what we spoke about, uniting heaven and earth. Thank you. There's some sort of attack in Yerushalayim. So, not now.
Hamas fired 7 rockets, they said, but there wasn't any damage. That's the last I heard. 7 rockets towards Yerushalayim and Beit Shemesh.
Oh, halavai, there should be peace. Shalom Yerushalayim. Does anybody know if the text of those Time magazines from '67 can be found online? Good question. Maybe try the Library of Congress, but thank God my parents saved it. It really is super interesting. These 3 seats are prescriptive. What we might like to see happen, but not descriptive. What actually was, at best, you can say there was a king in Judea, a high priest and priesthood, sometimes independent prophets, the ones we remember being independent. Okay, again, we were talking about what the ideal is. By the way, if we would have time, we'd go into the details. The Rambam in Hilchot Melachim talks about what is the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin, what is the jurisdiction of the king, and when do they both have to listen to the Navi and to the Urim Tumim. Again, about petition. This simply isn't the case in the UK. The BBC, Sky, and other channels are lying about the status of Jerusalem, not mentioning Yom Yerushalayim. The speaker appears to be overly optimistic about the way Israel is regarded. People in the UK and Europe are very angry that Israel appears to have done well with COVID. So I really was not aware that people, that's always a problem with being successful. Not that, if I were speaking to a non-Jewish audience, obviously I wouldn't want it. But as Jews, I think everybody here is proud of Jewish state. Even if a Jew wins gold medals in the Olympics, I imagine everybody here is proud. So how much more so the state of Israel?
I think here, what I can see here in the papers and stuff is Israel is used as a model. Even though not everybody supports all Israeli policies, I obviously don't have to tell you that. But they all the articles I see, they always say Israel is a model for the world and the vaccination. They always say Israel's number one. So I don't know, that somebody doesn't like it, but I can't comment on anybody else, but I can just comment on what I see living in Canada and reading the newspapers and, and the online and stuff. There isn't any, that's terrible that Israel's doing well. I think they're saying, why can't we do as well in Israel? How do they get their vaccines? And we don't. It's more of a,
but
that's the model to follow.
They do criticize the fact that the Palestinians weren't vaccinated.
That's a separate, yes and no. Okay, that's a separate thing, not for now, but, okay.
The Arab citizens of Israel all got vaccinations.
The Arab citizens all got vaccination.
Yeah.
Right.
We didn't vaccinate the Jordanians or Saudi Arabia. So.
Right.
Okay. Rav Kook believed
literature also talks about Israel and how it's done with COVID too.
Okay. Rav Kook believed in religion for limited in religion in the limited galut form. So does that mean he would be against forced forms of religion? Only voluntary religious affiliation like Judaism in the Golah, where persuasion and not legislation is used. That's a very interesting comment. We could have a whole shiur just on that topic. We know that Rav Kook was against religious legislation. On the other hand, the state of Israel is more complex. We know that if we were to accept reform and conservative converts and marriage, we would be influxed with hundreds of thousands of mamzerim, and there would be a serious problem of being able to marry each other. And the minimum of national unity is that we should be able to marry each other. These are big questions, but in general, you're correct. Rav Kook believes that part of the evolution of mankind is democracy, and that today, anybody who's religious is on a higher standard of religion than it used to be, because today, anybody who's religious is religious out of choice and out of identification, not just because of peer pressure like it used to be. So Rav Kook definitely does go in that direction. By the way, democratically, that also is happening. Statistically, the state of Israel is getting more and more and more religious, also because of religious childbirth, also religious aliyah. Also, most of those who are leaving Israel are not religious. And we have to start discussing how to make sure that we don't force religion on those who don't want to be religious, because democracy goes after the majority, but obviously we do have to take into account the needs and the freedom of everyone, for sure.
Rabbi,
big issues. Yeah.
May I guess perhaps, challenge you a little bit. I agree. I think what you very the choice, that's all wonderful. I think halakhically, Israel would be way better off accepting reform and conservative weddings. I'm not even talking ideology now. I'm just talking pure practical halakha. And the simple reason, of course, is the famous Chwat of Rav Moshe Feinstein. The problem today in Israel is everybody's forced to have an Orthodox wedding. So if they have an Orthodox wedding and they don't have an Orthodox divorce, then the kid's a mamzer. But as I'm sure many people here know, Rav Moshe, in a very radical, really radical tshuva, wild tshuva we don't have time to get into now, basically paskins that b'di'evet. He thinks you really do need a get, but b'di'evet, if you can't get a get after a reform or conservative wedding, you don't declare the kids mamzerim. And that's
Notice on this you don't hold like Rav Soloveitchik.
No. Even right, I have asked this question to many poskim. Not one of them has given me an answer. The answer is, well, it's the state of Israel. It's the, blah, blah, blah. But there's no halakhic answer. You would save many mamzerim, because what happens is non-religious Israelis don't care to get a divorce, and the woman either through marriage or non-marriage will have a kid with somebody else.
That's
Then that
a
kid's a
very
mamzer.
broad generalization.
That's
I don't
okay.
think
I
that's
just
accurate.
maybe afterwards. I do want to. If I may, I just wanted to throw that out there. And if I recall correctly, Rav Moshe has a tshuva. I have to look it up now, where he says you should never force somebody to get married halachically. Of course, if they want to get married halachically, it's wonderful. But to force it is really counterproductive, because then you're going to create more mamzerim that way. So I forget
Okay, that's interesting.
ideology, but
Food
I
for
just
thought.
wanted to point out halachically.
Right.
That's
I think it's also just for to give the whole picture. There aren't that many world-class post-game that would go in that direction.
no, everybody here
Today.
accepts Rav Moshe. It's totally 100%
No, I'm talking
acceptable.
about to bring
Oh.
the reform and
Yeah, oh yeah.
marriage and divorce
That's my
So that-
point. My point is it's a big mistake, in my humble opinion, which I
Okay.
know most
Okay.
people in the religious community disagree with me. My point is that even from a religious point of view, forget I haven't even in the human rights point of view, where actually leaving that whole issue aside, that Israel is the only country where you can't choose the rabbi who marries you. Any other country, leaving that issue aside, halachically speaking, I think it would be tremendously beneficial. Yes, I agree. My opinion is very much in the minority, which is maybe why I'm stating it. Just my prerogative here is the moderator. And again, no, because you mentioned it, but I think everything else you said, wonderful. I totally agree. I just wanted to at least raise that point to put it in your consciousness.
Okay.
Okay.
So we finished all of the comments.
Oh,
Yeah.
it did. Yeah. Okay, I think that did finish. Yes, just pointing out, if you want to check the Time magazine, go to your local library database. And okay, but yes, thank you for that. And I would ask you, but I don't want to be more controversial. Again, is the religious Zionist, is it true? I've seen a shift to the right in, since when I was a kid. And today, in sort of the Mizrahi religious Zionist, whatever word you want to call it, where there's less concern about the humanistic aspect and much more focused on the nationalism. Whereas I agree, you're presenting a wonderful ideal. I just don't know how true it is.
The way that I see it in Israel is that religious Zionism is so broad today. We're talking about millions of people, and there's room for this type of yeshivot and this type of yeshivot and this type. When you and I came to learn in Israel, so there was Kerem B'Yavna, there was Gush, there was Shalabim, there was HaKotel, maybe it just started.
No, HaKotel and BMT, that was it. Those are the 5 yeshivot.
And today within Israel, there are hundreds of, maybe even thousands of religious Zionist yeshivas, and everyone inevitably has a little different twist, where I think Rav Kook would summarize the twist by having a different mix of these 3 grounds, of these 3 ideologies.
Okay. All right. If anybody has any last minute questions, I know Rabbi Shwat is always willing to answer questions. We will have anybody. Otherwise, we say, really, thank you very much for that. Like you said, people commenting, clear, wonderful, and think important presentation. There's much food for thought, and obviously, like you say, everybody's going to want to emphasize different points, and sometimes it leads to disagreement. All I'll say is the most important part is we don't have to see people who disagree with us as our enemy. That's, I think, the biggest challenge we face today.
That's the key word here.
Right. In other words, you can disagree politically, and not from a political point of view. That's why it would be wonderful to have a national unity government. That's all I can say. That they're not our enemies, and the Democrats and Republicans don't have to be enemies either. But unfortunately, the world we live in today.
Now I had a share.
I'm sorry.
And in 10 minutes, I have a lecture.
Okay. All right. Anyways.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Next week is Shavuot.
Of course. Next week in Shvat, we'll resume in 2 weeks, and then in 3 weeks. 2 more parts of this 7-part series. Right. Have a Yom Yerushalayim Sameach, and B'Shalom, please God, we should have Yerushalayim of peace. And
Amen.
this evening,
Amen.
Mark Shapiro continues his wonderful series on his correspondence with great rabbinic figures. And tomorrow we finish the two series, one on Chassidut at 11 a.m. and then at 1:30 on Megillat Ruth. That's tomorrow. And then Wednesday, the regular shiurim during the week. So you get your email. We look forward to learning with you, and invite a friend, and everybody have a wonderful day. Be safe, be healthy, be well. And thank you very much.
B'Shalom Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi. Okay, be well. Bye-bye.